Hi everyone, I'm Rajkumar Pujari. I'm a fifth year PhD student at Purdue University. I work with Professor Dan Goldwasser. In this presentation, I'll describe our long paper titled Understanding Politics via Discourse Contextualization. Let's get into the presentation. Over the last decade or so, political discourse has moved to social media, of which Twitter is a huge part. Hence, political text tends to be concise and subtle. Let's consider this tweet. We need to treat our teachers better, we should keep them safe. Depending on the context and the author, this tweet could signal varied real world actions. Consider the context of a school shooting event and a Democrat author. The tweet is likely to translate to ban guns to avoid mass shootings in schools. Changing the author to Mike Pence, a conservative Republican, would alter the intended action to arming school teachers to stop active shooters. If we further change the contextual event to COVID-19 enforced school closure, the tweet could signal completely different actions depending on the author. Understanding such text and disambiguating it in representation space requires a complete understanding of its context. Here is a two-dimensional projection of how the above tweet in the context of school shooting event is disambiguated by our model proposed in this paper. As shown in the 2D projection, discourse contextualized representations of the same piece of text are closer to the unambiguous stances expressed by the respective authors. Let's look into the details of how we get there. Recent pre-trained language models aim to improve text representations by conditioning them on the left and right local context, but our setting calls for contextualization based on the real-world context of the text. Several data sources that describe the context are available, such as historic ideological quotes of the authors, news articles describing the events, discourse of the author in similar or related past events, authors' voting patterns, and known affiliations. We aim to model all of them together at once to produce effective representations, not only for the text, but also for the authors, issues, events, and other entities that appear in the text. The challenge is how can this massive amount of political content be used efficiently to create principled representations. Before moving forward, here is an outline of the presentation. I'll start with the data, then explain the model, and then the learning tasks and evaluation tasks, followed by the results and some qualitative visualizations. Let's start with the data. We collect a large amount of text data related to 367 US political events that fall under 8 mainstream political issues of interest and include 455 US politicians. Summary statistics of the data are shown here in the slide. We organize the entire data into a large graphical structure with textual and non-textual nodes. Let's look into how we organize the graph structure. We start with the author nodes, each associated with a Wikipedia text node that describes them. And then we put in the issue nodes, followed by the event nodes. Each event is related to a main issue and is connected by an edge. Following that, we have the textual nodes that includes tweets, press releases, and historical quotes of the authors and news articles. The documents are then linked to the authors and then to the events that they discuss. Further, we process the documents and extract the canonical entities that appear in the documents. Each referenced entity is connected to the document node in which it appears. This completes the graph structure organization of the data. Let's take a look at the model now. I'll start with an overview of the model. Our model consists of 3 modules: Graph Generator, Encoder, and Composer. Graph Generator takes a query triplet of authors, issues, and events as input. It generates a subgraph from the knowledge graph that is relevant to the input query. Encoder generates initial representations for each node in the subgraph given its topology and the text of the document nodes in the subgraph. Composer uses the graph structure to iteratively update the node embeddings. Let's look into each component in a little more detail, starting with the graph generator. Here is an example query triplet. It consists of authors, issues, and events of interest. In this example, author is Donald Trump, issue is guns, and the event is Florida shooting. The output subgraph looks like this, as shown in the slide. It is extracted from a huge knowledge graph that I described earlier. Note that the query mechanism also allows for querying groups of authors. Hence, it could also be used to characterize consensus stances of groups such as caucuses or an entire party. Let's move on to the encoder. Encoder is used to compute the initial node embeddings for all nodes in the subgraph. It consists of BERT, which is replaceable by any text representation model, followed by a bi-LSTM. For a text node, the initial representation is the BERT representation of the document text. For each non-textual node, it takes a sequence of documents as input, documents to which the node is connected in the subgraph. The documents are ordered temporally. We first encode the documents using BERT and then pool them using a bi-LSTM layer to generate the initial node embeddings for non-textual nodes. The initial node embeddings are then input to the composer module. Composer module takes initial node embeddings and the adjacency matrix as inputs and generates updated node embeddings. Composer architecture is a transformer-based graph attention network followed by a pooling layer. We use the encoding part of the transformer architecture as the graph attention network. We use the adjacency matrix of the graph as the attention mask input. The final node embeddings are then mean pooled to generate a summary embedding for the subgraph. Here is an overall view of the compositional reader architecture. Now let's move on to the baselines. We designed BERT adaptation baseline to benchmark our representations. Its architecture is same as the encoder module. Key difference between the adaptation baseline and the encoder output from the full model is that the latter is trained on the learning tasks via backpropagation through the composer module, while the adaptation baseline is trained directly on the learning tasks. We also compare our representations to the initial node embeddings generated by the encoder module and the pooled BERT representation baselines. Let's take a look at the learning tasks. We designed two link prediction tasks over the generated query graphs to train the encoder composer module. The first one is named Authorship Prediction. The second task is called Referenced Entity Prediction. Each task is designed with the objective of training the model to learn correlation between the language in the text and the real world context that encapsulates the text. Let's start with Authorship Prediction. The aim of the task is threefold. We aim to learn the correlation between a politician language versus 1. The language of news articles, 2. The language of other politicians, and 3. The language of the same politician in context of other issues. To generate data for this task, we take a data subgraph, for example as the one shown here. Take a document as shown in the highlighted tweet, remove the links to the document from the author and the event. Then, given the modified subgraph, we ask the yes-no binary question, which for this example shown in the slide would be, is this tweet Donald Trump talking about Florida shooting? Negative examples are then generated by replacing the tweet with 1. News articles, and 2. Documents from other authors, and 3. By documents from the same author but from a different event. Let's move on to the referenced entity prediction task now. This is also a binary classification task. Intuition behind this learning task is to enable our model to learn the correlation between the language used by a given politician in context of a specific referenced entity. To generate data, we take a subgraph as shown and a document in the subgraph. We then remove the link to the most frequent referenced entity in the graph and then mask all occurrences of that entity in the text. Then, given the modified subgraph to the model, we ask the yes-no binary question, which for the shown example would be, is the masked entity in this document NRA? Negative examples are generated by exchanging the entity with other wrong entities. Let's now take a look at the results on the learning tasks. The results show that the compositional reader model outperforms the BERT adaptation baseline on the learning tasks in both in-sample and out-of-sample settings. In-sample is when the test set contains authors that are present in the training set. Out-of-sample test set has only authors who are not present in the training set. Let's move on to the evaluation tasks now. The aim of our strategy is to evaluate how well our representations reflect the actual meaning of the text in its real-world context. We design multiple quantitative and qualitative tasks to verify our hypothesis. They are listed on the slide. Let's take a look at each of them in more detail, starting with political grades data. Let me introduce the political grades data. Organizations such as NRA, LCV, and Planned Parenthood release issue-specific ratings of US politicians based on their voting patterns on the issue the organization cares about. Grades are indicative of politicians' overall activity on the issue and how well it aligns with the grading organization's stance. We designed two evaluation tasks to test whether our representations are effectively able to 1. Align with the grades in a zero-shot setting called the grade paraphrase task, and 2. Predict the grades given politicians' public discourse, which is the grade prediction task. Let me explain each task in further detail before looking at the results, starting with the grade paraphrase task. In this task, we evaluate the zero-shot language equivalence capabilities of our representations. Grades are divided into two classes. We formulate representative sentences for them, as shown for NRA data in this slide. We find the nearest class to the each politician's issue representation based on their cosine similarity. This task doesn't involve any training process. Now, let's take a look at the grade prediction task. In this task, given a politician's public discourse related to a specific issue, the aim of the task is to predict their organizational grade. For NRA data, it is designed as a 5-class classification task. We perform 10-fold cross-validation. We compare the performance of the compositional reader representations to the 3 strong baselines. pooled BERT embeddings, BERT adaptation baseline, and encoder embeddings. We design a similar evaluation task for LCV grades as well. Now let's take a look at the results. As shown here in the slide, Compositional Reader outperforms pooled BERT and BERT adaptation baseline on all the tasks. It outperforms the encoder embeddings in zero-shot setting as well. We have other quantitative evaluation tasks such as roll call prediction in the paper that are dropped from this presentation in the interest of time. Now let's take a look at some interesting qualitative visualizations. First, we see a group of representations of US politicians on the issue guns. Red dots represent Republicans while the blue triangles are Democrats. We observe that guns can be a polarizing issue. We show similar visualizations for other issues in the paper, some more polarizing than the others. Next, let's zoom in further and see an interesting visualization involving three particular politicians. One of them is Mitch McConnell, whose views on guns and environment issues align with the traditional conservative ideology. Another is Bernie Sanders, who has left-wing views on both the issues. Then we see the interesting case of Francis Rooney, who is a Florida Republican whose views on the issue of guns align with the Republican ideology, but he has a staunch progressive views on the issue environment. This visualization demonstrates that this fact is nicely captured in our representations. Let's take a look at another qualitative demonstration. This task is named Opinion Descriptor Generation. In this task, we identify the adjectives that are closest to the politician's representation in the embedding space according to their cosine similarity. The results, shown here in the slides, display interesting adjectives that are revealing and largely consistent with the overall views of the respective politicians on each of the issues. To conclude, we tackle the problem of understanding politics, that is, creating unified representations of the political figures, capturing their views and legislative preferences directly from raw political discourse data originating from multiple sources. We propose a compositional reader model that composes multiple documents in one shot to form a unified political entity representation while capturing the real-world context needed for representing the interactions between these documents. We hope that this work sparks research in multiple directions on this front. Some of them are listed here. The first is building datasets that require understanding real-world context to be solved. The second is building better models to capture real-world context into text embeddings. The third is towards developing more helpful learning tasks that helps in capturing various aspects of text in context. And lastly, towards developing a thorough and exhaustive evaluation framework for such models. Now, we acknowledge and thank the contributions that made this work possible and helped make this work many times better. Thank you for listening and feel free to contact me with any questions.